Hello and welcome to Tenancy Deposit Scheme's latest webinar presented by Michael Hill, Operations Manager at TDS. For those of you who haven't joined our previous webinars, my name is Ben Michaelis and I support with the webinar operations and delivery at TDS. I have the pleasure of hosting today's webinar. We're really grateful that you could join us today as we present this mid-tenancy focus webinar, which is titled How to Respond to Mid-Tenancy Rental Changes and Deposits During COVID-19. Just before we start, I'd really like to thank everybody for being able to attend today. And we really hope that the information that we can provide is useful to everybody during these unprecedented times. Just before I hand over to Michael, I'd like to make you aware of a couple of points before we start. The first is we'd really like to hear from you today and feel free to ask questions. Please use the toolbar on the left-hand side of your screen if you're using a desktop computer. Michael and I will review all of the questions at the end of the presentation and do our best to answer as many of these as possible. Like our previous webinars, we have actually lengthened our Q&A session today to help those people who would like to ask questions. Secondly, should you wish to take notes of today's session, you can do so. There is a button or an icon within your webinar platform that shows a piece of paper, and a pencil on top. This function will also allow you to email yourself the notes afterwards, which is quite handy from a follow-up perspective. Just one final point to note, sometimes when we're working from home, we can experience connectivity and internet issues. In the unfortunate event that this does happen, please try to refresh your web page in the first instance. Hopefully this works for you. If for any reason this doesn't work, please close the webinar in your internet browser and try to click back onto your webinar reminder email to completely refresh your connection. Hopefully this solves any issues that you might have. That's everything from me, and a warm welcome to anybody just joining us now. That's hopefully the start of our really interesting session on mid-tenancy. Michael, that's everything for me. I'd now like to hand over to you.
Thanks, Ben, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's TDS webinar, and thank you for joining us this morning. I hope you're all keeping well and dealing with these difficult and somewhat challenging times. As Ben said, today's webinar is about how to respond to rental changes and deposits during this COVID-19 pandemic. By way of introduction, my name is Michael Hill. I joined TDS in 2015 and have worked as a caseworker and as an adjudicator for end of tenancy disputes. I've spent some time working as executive assistant to our CEO, Steve Harriott, but the majority of my time is now spent as operations manager for our zero deposit adjudication scheme. So today's agenda, we'll take a look at where you can find answers to some of the questions you have. We'll look at some mid-tenancy questions we've had. We'll look at where to find some further guidance, and finally, I'll open up the floor to a Q&A session where we'll welcome your questions. So first up, just a little further information on where you can find guidance. Our website has general guidance for letting agents and landlords on a range of matters. We keep the information section of our website up to date with case studies and an array of guides which can be useful. And you can also head over to tenancydepositscheme.com/COVID-19, which is a page we've set up to deal with specific questions arising as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we aim to keep this updated to ensure the information is as useful as possible to yourselves. So some commonly asked questions that we've had for mid-tenancy. So the first is, I'm temporarily reducing my tenant's rent. Can I claim this from the deposit when the tenancy ends? So it seems here that the rent is being reduced for the tenant as a gesture of goodwill, but the rent is not being waived. It's still owed by the tenant at a later date. So I'd say the key to agents and landlords is making sure that both parties understand that this is a rent deferral. And that the rent is still due, and it's still due for the period in question. So, for example, the 5th of January to the 4th of February. What you're doing is you're just offering the tenant a temporary reduction for them to pay it at a later date. So assuming that the tenancy was to come to an end and the tenants failed to pay this rent, you could make a claim from the deposit. But it's worth noting that the deposit adjudication process is evidence-based, and so it would be useful to have it in writing that you've made the tenant aware that it's just a deferral rather than a holiday from paying the rent altogether. So if you can provide that evidence during the dispute, then any claim for that rent should be successful. Okay, so this is a really good question. We've had this asked a number of times. So the question, I'm reducing my tenant's rent on a temporary basis, and I'm not deferring any shortfall. I'm simply absorbing the reduction. Will the deposit cap be an issue? So you'll all be familiar with the Tenant Fees Act, which cap deposits at 5 weeks rent if the annual rent is below 50,000, or 6 weeks rent if the annual rent is £50,000 or more. If landlords are choosing to make a reduction in the rent as a gesture of goodwill and are not requesting the money back at a later date, how does this affect the deposit held under the Tenant Fees Act? So if we're to take an example of this, let's say your rent is £800 per month, which is around £184 a week. The maximum deposit you can take under the Tenant Fees Act would be £923.10. If you then chose to reduce the rent due each month due to Covid-19 to, let's say, £650 a month, the weekly rent becomes £150 and the maximum deposit under the Tenant Fees Act reduces to £750. So the question is whether you would have to repay any excess above that £750 because you've reduced the rent. So the Tenant Fees Act sets out that the deposit cap is based on the value of the rent at the time of the tenancy's grant, renewal or continuance. And therefore, if you're to make a reduction in rent, you will not need to repay part of the deposit. The only exception to this is if you're creating a new tenancy with the tenant or a renewal, if you like, and at this point you're reducing the rent. And therefore, obviously, upon renewal, the rent in the agreement would be less and you would have to repay part of the deposit, taking into account the new rent which you've agreed with the tenant. We obviously have a deposit cap calculator on our website to help you with that process, or you can feel free to reach out to us if you're looking for further guidance on it. But as I say, if you are just reducing the rent for the tenant for a short period or mid-tenancy and it's not a renewal, then you will not need to repay part of the deposit because you will not be in breach of the Tenant Fees Act. So just a reminder to those of you joining us this morning to get involved. You can ask any questions you have on the questions tab of your screen, as Ben said earlier. If you'd like to submit some questions you have to us, we'll be taking a look at some of these, as many as we can, in a short while after I've run through a couple more questions and a bit more guidance. Please feel free to ask as many as you like, as you know, we'd love to hear from you, and we'll try and get through as many as we possibly can. I'm also going to take this opportunity to invite you to take part in a snap poll. So the previous question, I talked about the Tenant Fees Act, and so we thought we would ask you, with the end of the Tenant Fees Act transitional period coming to an end on the 1st of June 2020, would a webinar specifically about this be of any interest to you? So the question should pop up on your screen, and I'll give you a few seconds to review that, and then I will publish the results. So that should pop up for you now. If you could just have a vote so that we can tailor our webinars to those that would be helpful to you. Just a few more of you answering. I'll give you a few more seconds on that.
Looks like a fairly conclusive landslide on that one.
It does, yeah. I've just published that now. So it looks like the majority of you would be interested in a webinar on that. As I say, the transitional period is due to come to an end on the 1st of June 2020, which will have an effect on some ongoing tenancies. So what we can look to do is we can look to pull together a webinar with some more information about that to try and guide you. So thank you for taking part in that. So So we've got a couple more commonly asked questions for mid-tenancy, which I'll run through, and then, as I said, I'll open up the floor. So the next question is, my tenant is a student and is leaving the property. Do they have to pay rent? So the short answer to this is yes. The tenancy is ongoing until it comes to the end of the fixed term, or it's ended appropriately by one of the parties through the service of notice. Whether the tenant chooses to live in the property or relocate to their family home or move in with a friend, rent is still due on that tenancy. So in this case, tenants, students in particular, do not have any additional privileges. They should be treated the same as all other tenants, and rent is still due. And so the final question that we have is, my tenant can't pay their rent and wants to use the deposit. Can they do so? So it's a good question. The legislation makes it clear that the deposit is for use at the end of the tenancy rather than mid-tenancy. If the tenancy comes to an end and your tenant owes rent, then of course you can propose a deduction from the deposit for that rent. If this is your tenant's proposal, mid-tenancy, for them to use the deposit, then it's likely that they would agree, and you can just use the deposit for the rent, and that will settle the matter. However, if you allow your tenant to skip any rent on the basis that you'll take it from the deposit, what you're essentially doing is reducing the available deposit for the end of the tenancy. So let's say, for example, you have a deposit of around £920, so that's based on rent of £800 a month. You would be left with just £120 if you was to take the final month's rent from the deposit. So, you know, hopefully you've got a good tenant who's looked after the property and there won't be any problems. But let's say that there's cleaning required or some damage to an item or maybe some gardening required. You're going to be left with just £120 from the deposit to try and sort of carry out any remedial works if you allow the tenant to use that £800 for rent. So, you know, you could pursue the tenant through the courts, of course, for any dilapidations, but, you know, that can be time consuming and costly. So it's something to bear in mind. Obviously, you can use the deposit for your tenant's final month's rent, but obviously that would reduce the available funds you have for other matters. Okay, so we've got a short slide on how to get things right. Obviously, as I said, these are unprecedented times, and you know, you get a wealth of queries from your tenants. So some quick tips on how to get these things right. So firstly, we'd recommend keeping an audit trail. You may receive some requests or suggestions from your tenant during these times, and we just recommend that you keep an audit trail of any agreements you reach with your tenants, so that you have these in writing and you can use them as evidence if you do end up in a disagreement. And you know, having it in writing and communicating like that also keeps both parties clear on what's expected from them, and there's sort of no confusion there. As always, retain invoices or receipts for costs you've incurred, which you're intending to pass on to the tenant, and just be sure to communicate these with your tenant to ensure that they know they're liable for any costs. So we see a lot of end of tenancy disputes where a cost is passed to the tenant, but the tenant isn't aware that it would be passed on for them. So it could be a cost that's arisen during the tenancy, and the tenant wasn't under the impression that would be passed on to them. So, you know, we would just recommend that if you were planning to pass a cost on to the tenant, you let the tenant know and get it in writing. This ties in quite nicely with my next point, I guess. So trying to avoid disputes. The best way to prepare for your end of tenancy process is to operate efficiently during the tenancy, I guess. And the best way to do that is just to communicate with your tenant, be clear, discuss any issues you have with them, and hopefully you'll be able to reach an agreement when those issues arise rather than waiting until the end of the tenancy. We've had some questions around periodic property inspections, and you know, we probably have some more being submitted as we speak. Can you find an alternative to the traditional method? So obviously it's difficult right now while we're in lockdown to visit tenants in their property to carry out an inspection. So you do need to look at whether you can use an alternative solution for that. It may be that you arrange a phone call or a video call with your tenant where they can, you know, walk around the property and just highlight any issues which they might notice with the property. You know, that kind of inspection, it's not as valuable as being able to see the property firsthand yourselves, but at least you're still providing the tenant with an opportunity to raise any issues. You know, my view on this is that it's important to provide the tenant with that opportunity, because if at the end of the tenancy there is, damage or issues in the property, you don't want the tenant to say that the only reason they were not communicated was that there was no opportunity to do so, no periodic inspection. So I think, either emailing them, giving them a call, giving them that opportunity to raise those issues is the most valuable part of that. So just a final call for questions. As I said earlier, if you do have any questions, please submit them. There's a question tab on your screen, I believe. You can submit as many as you like, and we'll run through them. And as I said earlier, just a final reminder of where you can find any sort of help or guidance. So we do have FAQs for COVID-19 on our website if you enter the URL displayed on your screen now. And there is also government guidance available at www.gov.uk/coronavirus. We will also be running these webinars regularly, so do feel free to join us, and we'll try to keep you up to date with all of the latest information as it progresses.
Michael, thank you so much for that. That was extremely helpful, and hopefully that allows everyone to have a little bit more clarity on mid-tenancy related scenarios during this pandemic. So thank you very much for that. I think now's a good time if we can progress on to some questions, if that's okay with you.
Of course, yeah.
And go to some of the ones that we've received from the audience to start with. The first one I'd like to ask you comes from Rosalind, who asks, tenancy is due to come out at the end of the 30th of April. Tenant is stuck in Thailand, and the landlord has agreed to extend the tenancy for 3 months to give him time to get back to the UK. The rent was reduced from $1,350 to $700. Do I have to pay him back the same deposit now?
Thank you, Rosalind. It's a good question. So, I guess it depends on the nature of the extension. So if the tenancy is just continuing as a periodic tenancy, you've agreed with the tenant that you will just extend it for 3 months, and that there will be a rent reduction, then you don't have to make any changes to the deposit. As I said, it's just a continuing tenancy, and there's no need to make any changes there. If you're, I don't see why you would be, but I guess if you're signing a renewal or a continuance of that and an addendum, and you're agreeing a reduction in rent there, then at that point you would have to reduce the deposit. So you would essentially, depend on what scheme you're in, but you could log onto our website, use the deposit calculator to calculate what the deposit should be, and just reduce the protected deposit and repay any excess to the tenant. But as I say, the easiest way to go is probably just to agree with the tenant that the tenancy is just going to continue for a further period of 3 months, on a rolling basis, and that the rent will be reduced from, I think you said $1,350 down to $700, and therefore you won't have to reduce the deposit or pay back any excess.
Super, thank you for that, Michael. Rosalind, hopefully that answers your question. Next question comes in from Atul, and he asks, the tenant has asked the landlord, and the landlord has agreed to waive rather than defer the rent up to 50%. The landlord has agreed to this. Is this possible, and would the landlord risk a challenge for the waived rent to be not as the market rent?
Okay, so it is obviously possible. You have the tenancy agreement, which sets out the amount of the rent. If the parties agree between them to waive part of that rent due to certain circumstances, obviously the ones we're experiencing now, I don't see that there's any problem with that. It's the same as, for example, a landlord agreeing to waive a month or two's rent because there's remedial works being carried out at the property. So I think a landlord is well within their right to agree that they can waive part of the rent for a period. I don't think that there's too much risk about the market rent. I assume there you're talking about when the property's relet, if the tenancy had been running at below market rent, but obviously it's a side agreement between the parties that part of that rent will be waived for whatever circumstances, and I don't think it has an effect going forward on what the rent of the property should be when the property's relet.
Thank you for that, Michael. Hopefully that answers the question for you there. Next one comes a good question, actually. If the tenant signs a declaration to use the deposit mid-tenancy for rent, would this not equate to an amended would this not equate to an amendment to the tenancy agreement terms, wording dependent? It's a slightly different angle, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think it would, and I mean, obviously, if the chances are it wouldn't come to a dispute with TDS if the tenant has agreed that the deposit can be used for rent. If it did, and obviously you had a signed declaration with the tenant which said, that they agree that the deposit can be used for outstanding rent, then that deposit would just be awarded. So I think the situation here is that if the tenant makes that agreement, then any deposit held will be paid to the landlord at the end of the tenancy, assuming there's still rent outstanding. That the tenant has basically agreed during the tenancy that can be used. I guess the only confusion there would be if the tenant managed to settle the rent before the end. I presume that obviously the deposit there would be no deductions against the deposit because the tenant's cleared the rental account, and so it would be repaid. As I said in the slide, there's nothing wrong with doing it that way. If the tenant owes rent and agrees the deposit can be used for that and signs it over, that's fine. The risk is just that you utilise that. You make an agreement with the tenant and you utilise that deposit for the rent, and then there's no money really left in the pot, I guess, for any damage or cleaning or gardening required, if there is any at the end of the tenancy.
Thank you very much for that, Michael. Another good question here, which relates to a slightly different perspective. Do you accept periodic inspections as part of your dispute evidence? This is a good question.
It is a good question, yeah, and we do accept periodic inspections. There's absolutely nothing wrong with submitting them. They're useful for the adjudicator to show, for example, that an item or an area was not damaged at a certain point of the tenancy. So it might be a year into a 2-year tenancy, and it might show that the decor was in a very good condition, and therefore we're able to establish that any damage has arisen in the past, 6 months or a year, for example. They're not particularly useful as evidence for claims like cleaning, redecoration, or gardening, in the sense that the period between the periodic inspection and the checkout report, the tenant could have rectified any issues. So I would recommend that if you are submitting them, you submit them along with a checkout report to show that the damage or the issues noted in the periodic inspection are still present, because it will ultimately be the checkout report that is used as the key document to show how the property was left. But as I say, for example, they're good. Imagine if you didn't have a check-in report, but you had a periodic inspection that showed that something was in a good working condition. That's sort of a benchmark for us that it was working at one point and not at the end.
Super. Thank you for that. And actually, our next question is quite tied into that, to do with inspections. Question says, recently I laid a new carpet in the property, and I tend to use mid-term inspections to record these changes. I'm worried that I won't have an opportunity to record the carpet as newly fitted before any damage or issues may occur, as I can't undertake a mid-term inspection. How's best to approach this?
Yeah, so I think obviously it's a difficult time to take a midterm inspection. We've talked about that earlier. I think I'd recommend that in this instance you make alterations to the check-in report if you have one. So the best thing to do would be to take your original check-in report, to comment on it that a new carpet has been fitted. Describe the carpet, describe if you've got the invoice, the receipt, maybe attach it, and just sign and date it. State that it's newly laid. And as I say, sign and date the amendments, and then I would send that report across to the tenant, just for them to confirm that there is a new carpet, it's newly laid. Hopefully they'll sign that as well and say, yeah, they accept, that a new carpet's been laid. But even if they don't, at least you've got an audit trail to show that, you updated the check-in, and you sent it across to the tenant so they could note if there was any issues with the carpet. Assuming they don't, then we can assume that carpet was newly fitted and in good condition. And as I say, I'd also keep the invoice, the receipt, anything you have to show that the work was carried out. So that being unable to undertake a midterm inspection shouldn't really have a detrimental impact on that.
So it really goes back to what you were reiterating in your presentation, really, about that final slide around best practice, doing the right things, keeping an audit trail, and doing those things that really are important to make sure you can evidence and prove these things if anything happened later on down the line.
Exactly. Yeah. That's just the best way to do it. And I think, as I say, the audit trail was, you always have that to fall back on, and you can always show that at least you made the effort to send it to the tenant, or to get it in the so that all parties were aware of what was going on, essentially.
Absolutely. Good question here around the Tenants Fees Act, and obviously, uh, this is a really good question at a time when people are just trying to understand it and try and get to the detail of it. You mentioned the Tenants Fees Act transitional period coming to an end. What exactly is this referring to?
Okay, yeah. So obviously, as I said, we will hopefully undertake a webinar on this, and we can set out all of the relevant information to yourselves. To touch upon it in this webinar, the Tenant Fees Act essentially sets out a 1-year transitional period, which runs from the 1st of June 2019 to, I guess, the 31st of May 2020, for landlords and agents to essentially update their tenancy agreement. So it's almost a grace period for agents and landlords to review the legislation and make any sort of changes they need to make to their tenancy agreements. During this 1-year period, any tenancies which started pre-fee ban and include clauses such as charging the tenant for a checkout fee, they continue to be binding on the tenant. So the assumption there is, that the tenancy started pre-fee ban, and therefore they've agreed to those clauses. The Tenant Fees Act does ban a number of charges, obviously, and one of them is for example, checkout fee. So once the 1-year transitional period comes to an end, the Act will essentially apply to all applicable tenancy agreements, regardless of the date that they was entered into. So that tenancy which started pre-fee ban and contains a clause obligating the tenant to pay for a checkout fee, that specific clause will essentially become redundant and it won't be binding on the tenant. So whilst the remainder of the tenancy remains intact, the end of the transitional period does have an effect on some clauses in the agreement. So it's just worth being aware of those.
Next question comes in from Sean, who asks, if it is not possible to get prices to rectify a property after the tenant moves out, but evidence is due, will you provide longer for the agent landlord to get the evidence, or will you have a reasonable idea on how much should be awarded?
Yes, that's a good question. Thank you, Sean. I mean, obviously, the time it takes to raise a dispute, it can take a couple of weeks anyway. You might propose some deductions to the tenant. You might, be in negotiation with the tenant. In our insured scheme, you have 3 months to raise a dispute. In our custodial scheme, there is a repayment process where we sort of have a self-resolution portal where the parties can negotiate, which we find to be quite successful. And obviously, during those periods, you could look to contact, get a quote or receipt for the works. We don't require them. We say that they're good evidence, they're supplementary evidence, and they evidence the loss suffered. However, our adjudicators, are experienced. They know the normal costs of these types of works, and therefore, if you don't have a quote or a receipt and you're not able to get one, that's absolutely fine. We don't say that you have to have had the work carried out. You just have to evidence that a loss has been suffered, and our adjudicator can reach a decision on how much is justified for the works.
Super, thank you so much for that. A different type of question now. If I have deposits with 2 schemes, is there an easy way to switch them all to TDS?
Yes, and we'd welcome you to do so. So obviously you may have deposits protected with one of the other 2 schemes. We have a dedicated switching team, so we can do most of it for you. We'll reach out to the other scheme and we will essentially collect the details and start to enter into our system. I think at the end of this slideshow, my email address is going to appear on the screen on the presentation. So if you just send me across an email, I can put you in touch with our switching team, who can sort of give you all of the information on our 2 schemes, and they can action that for you.
Thank you for clarifying that. Another question in from Sylvia. A bit more of an in-depth one for you, Michael. As the 14-day quarantine period is likely to be introduced at the end of May, our student tenants are asking if they can extend their tenancy to ensure they can make it back in time for the end of their contract, which is on the 30th of June. Should we advise for them to get back mid-June to allow for the 14 days period before the tenancy is ending on the 30th of June, or should we ask the landlord to extend? This is a bit of a more specific one. Where would you come at it from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's a difficult one, I guess. I mean, the 14-day quarantine period, your tenants, I guess, are essentially saying if they can come back on, the 29th to 30th only, then they would like the tenancy extended for 14 days so that they can remain in the property, carry out the checkout process and move out. I guess you're not under any obligation to extend the tenancy, so you could be saying to the tenants that, as you say, it's best to try and get back around mid-June if they wish to have those 14 days quarantined before the end of the tenancy and move their stuff out. But it completely depends on the circumstances. If the tenants, if they're good tenants and they're happy to pay their rent for those 14 days, and the landlord doesn't have another tenancy lined up, then I don't see any problem with extending the tenancy for 14 days. And it's almost like the tenancy's they've just overstayed for a period of 14 days and they've paid the rent, and it will come to an end at a later date. But I don't think you're legally obligated to extend that. So it might be that you inform the tenants, if the landlord doesn't want to do that there may be a new tenancy lined up, or the landlord needs the property back to carry out remedial works, and therefore if they wish to do that, they should just arrive mid-June, as you say. So I think either way works. I guess it's just dependent on the flexibility of the landlord, and if the tenants are happy to pay the rent for those 14 days and end it on good terms.
Thank you for that. And ultimately, it's everyone's got their own unique scenarios here, haven't they? And it's just about a sensible approach moving forward for your scenario. Next question I have is, my tenants have moved out, but they said that they could not dump much of the rubbish because the bin was full and the dump was closed. If the tenant physically cannot clear the property through no fault of their own, who should bear the cost?
Yeah, so really good question as well, actually. I guess the starting point is that you have the tenancy agreement, which places obligations on the tenants and the landlords, and you'll need to look in that to see who's under what obligation. The majority of tenancy agreements include a clause which says that the tenant will remove any rubbish at the end of the tenancy, and so I guess what you're essentially asking here is if they can't do that, if the bins aren't being collected or the dump is closed, can they be charged for it? And I guess the question is, yes, I guess they can. Technically, they've breached the agreement by not removing the rubbish. As harsh as it sounds, I guess they could have taken it with them. But I guess the real question is whether there's a need to charge them. So if the landlord can have that removed, or it can be taken to the dump at a small cost, or the bins will be collected at a later date, then there may be no reason to charge the tenant. But also if the landlord incurs a cost having that rubbish removed before a new tenant moves in, then I don't see any reason why that couldn't be passed on to the tenant, as long as they're obligated in the tenancy agreement to remove that rubbish.
Thank you so much, and hopefully that answers the question. We're going to come on to one final question for you, Michael.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned in the webinar to make the terms of any agreement with the tenant clear. If we give a tenant permission to remove an item during the tenancy but do not specify it will require replacing, can we claim at the end of the tenancy?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. Your tenancy agreement will likely obligate the tenant to leave all items in the property. And if you alter this obligation by some agreement with the tenant, you'll need to be clear that the tenant must replace the item and they wasn't just given permission to dispose of it. So I guess in this case, you've said to the tenant, yes, you can remove the wardrobe from the property, it's no longer needed. If the tenant then goes and disposes of that item and you haven't told them that they need to replace it, then I think it's going to be quite difficult at the end of the tenancy to make a claim against the tenant for the missing item. I think you need to be clear when you're setting out your terms of the agreement that, yes, you can remove the wardrobe, but you will need to replace it or return it at the end of the tenancy, so the tenant's aware of the obligation. The adjudicator will normally take the approach of what's reasonable for the parties to conclude based on any agreement or correspondence. And I think that if you've just said to the tenant they can remove or dispose of an item, then it's reasonable to conclude that they probably won't replace it unless you ask them to.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you very much for tackling those questions. Obviously, they're very challenging based on everybody's unique circumstances and obviously this unprecedented time. Let's just move on now. Just to reiterate again to everybody the information and guidance. Take a look at the Tenancy Deposit Scheme's FAQ page on the website. This is all tailored around COVID-19. www.tenancydepositscheme.com/COVID-19 is the place to look for that, and then also the government guidance on the Gov website, which is www.gov.uk/coronavirus. That brings our webinar to an end today. I want to take the opportunity to thank everybody who was able to join us, and a big thank you to Michael, to you too, for tackling the testing questions and going through the presentation and the scenarios for everybody. The webinar recording will be made available to everybody soon and emailed to you, so look out for that. There will also be a very short one-question feedback survey at the end of this webinar. If you could spare just a few seconds to complete this, we'd be most grateful, because this will allow us to improve our webinar content moving forward. Just another note that there will also be a handout PDF available to you in your thank you email, which will arrive shortly after the webinar ends. The PDF file provides you with a single clickable link to access our COVID-19 FAQs webpage for ease. The link to the PDF is located around halfway down your email, so just look out for that too. And yeah, thank you so much for everybody once again for joining us today. It's obviously an unprecedented time, and we're really grateful that you could join us. Michael, once again, thank you to you. Thank you again. And that concludes everything from us today. And goodbye from us, and hope to see you again all very soon.